I hope that y'all didn't think that you would get out of this video without me having like somewhat of a controversial take about something. Okay, hi everybody. Thanks for coming back if you've been here before, or hi, welcome if you're new. My name's Mickey. I'm a therapist and we talk about therapy things on this channel. And today we're talking about trigger warnings because I have been aware of the research surrounding trigger warnings for a while, and also you guys asked me to talk about them. So we're doing that today. Let's jump into trigger warnings. And are they useless? First of all, obviously, as a clinician, I'm sort of aware, or was sort of aware before I did all this research, about the evidence, the research surrounding trigger warnings. And y'all have asked me to talk about that because it's kind of contentious, actually. It's a little bit of a button for people, which, that said, don't come at me, okay? Don't start with me. Please don't shoot the messenger on this one because there is some contentious data here that we're going to go over. I think this is a conversation that's important to have with nuance and with care. That said, there might also be some things in this video that you disagree with, and that's fine. You can disagree with them, but please don't be rude. Especially if you're new here. Hi, thanks for coming. Don't be rude to my friends in the comment section. People here generally are really kind and wonderful, and I'd like it to stay that way. So let's all just be kind to one another. Okay, so trigger warnings as we understand them today originated in communities that were created to address what was then our very early understanding of PTSD. Essentially, at that time, it was referred to as like a veterans only thing, which obviously we know now that's not how PTSD works. But in those support groups and communities, there was a concerted effort to help to avoid or to try to avoid certain subject matters or to give people a heads up before engaging in like a group support environment that certain things might come up, et cetera, et cetera. And that later evolved in the 90s to become labeled as trigger warnings on feminist blogs and other types of media. That blossomed into the trigger warnings that we know today, which were then incorporated into college campuses and things like that, which was actually met with a really heavy criticism, particularly from the like conservative right. There was a lot of like snowflake labeling, right? About how like not even education's safe anymore, these mamby-pamby kids. And like really what it was college educators making an effort to be kind and compassionate to their students, especially in our, again, like somewhat early understanding of what trigger warnings actually were. There has been a lot of media hubbub about trigger warnings also, especially these critiques that trigger warnings encourage avoidance and that they suppress free speech, and also that trigger warnings coddle people. Again, I told you a lot of the media discourse around this was about like coddling kids and like, you know, the snowflake kids and whatever. So obviously, as we do, the academic community, you know, garnered an interest in actually evaluating what are trigger warnings, how do they actually work, how do our brains interface with things like trigger warnings. And so I have some interesting data to go over with you today, but first I want to talk about what the actual media coverage has been, because we've gotten a lot of like very kind of headlines, some of which say things like trigger warnings are useless and that trigger warnings actually induce or increase anxiety, and also that they make our lives worse. I'll show you some of the headlines that are like actually from somewhat recent articles and write-ups and think pieces and things like that. So there's a lot for us to go over here. A lot of what those articles are, you know, written about is one study that was conducted. The research that's often being referenced in these very like ooh-ah type of articles is actually a meta-analysis. In my opinion, the meta-analysis does bring up some actually valid criticisms that we're going to talk about. And also, like I said, this is a conversation that has to be had with nuance because I think a lot of these very sensationalized article titles are very much reaching, especially for the purpose of gaining clicks and views. And like, you guys get how the internet works. So the first thing that I want to talk to you about is that trigger warnings don't actually decrease distress when people are being exposed to disturbing material. The actual quote from the article I think is like kind of interesting, so I'm gonna read it to you. It says, the existing published research almost unanimously suggests that trigger warnings do not mitigate distress. The meta-analysis talks about how the trigger warnings don't decrease distress, ultimately because they don't really do anything, right? And it's not because they're like useless, as some of these article titles say, but it's just that they don't actually do the thing that I think a lot of people were hoping that they would do, but this doesn't make them bad, right? I think this is an important distinction. While they don't necessarily decrease distress, that, in my opinion, as trigger warnings, the use of them has evolved, is not really why we use them. We're going to talk about that later. Let me talk to you about some other parts of the research first before we get there. Before we go any further, though, I want to talk to you about this week's sponsor, which is Dipsea. We've worked with Dipsea before, and I love them. For those of you that don't know, Dipsea is an app for spicy audiobooks that was created by women for women. And actually, a fun fact about me is that I used to really love reading paper books, but I'm really busy, so I rarely have the chance to do that anymore. But I've been spicing up my me time again with Dipsea's spicy audiobooks and really loving it. The app has over 1,000 stories that are crafted by professional writers and some really top tier narrators too. The app is also really easy to navigate, so you can narrow in on your favorite genres like historical or sapphic stories. They also have characters for everything. Like they have a story with a rugged cowboy, all the way up to things like gods of the underworld. So they really have something for every taste. They also release new chapters every week, so you can always count on finding something new to enjoy and get lost in. I have been really loving spicing up my me time, and I think that you really will too. So for listeners of the show, Dipsea is offering an extended 30-day free trial when you go to dipseastories.com/Mickey. That's 30 days of full access for free when you go to dipseastories.com/Mickey, dipseastories.com/Mickey. Thanks again to Dipsea for sponsoring this week's video. Let's go ahead and hop back in. One thing that trigger warnings do actually is that they do increase anticipatory anxiety, which is a problem. Essentially what happened in this meta-analysis, they were able to, aggregate this data to ascertain that when people are exposed to trigger warnings, they do seem to have a spike in their subjective and their objective anxiety triggers. Essentially, when we measured their objective data, so things like their heart rate, their respiration rate, their blood pressure, we did notice an increase in those things and also in their subjective accounts. So typically the way that we measure this is on something called a SUDS scale, a subjective units of distress scale. We ask folks to rate 1 through 10. How disturbed were you in this moment versus this moment, right? So in both subjective and objective data, the trigger warnings did increase anticipatory anxiety. However, this is not to say that trigger warnings specifically are like a bad thing, but just, I think, a commentary about how intelligent and adaptive brains are. We talked before about how the brains are elastic. The brain is elastic and how it's capable of adapting to its surroundings. And it's like a very intelligent organism, right? We all know that. I think the brain is really cool. I won't bore you with that speech so much as I do just want to drive home the point that trigger warnings have essentially just become a replacement for the actual disturbing material, right? What we observed in this, congregation of data is that in giving people like essentially a heads up, it didn't actually decrease their distress in terms of like viewing disturbing material. And it did potentially like spike their anxiety beforehand, because we know now our brains have adapted now to understand that a trigger warning means disturbing material is coming, right? In the same way that we can like Pavlov dogs, or that in The Office when Jim gives Dwight an Altoid when his computer restarts, that he started salivating, right? This is like a perfect encapsulation of like how that works. Your brain has essentially adapted to understand that disturbing material is coming, and so your anxiety level goes up. That said, one thing that trigger warnings do not do definitively in the research is create avoidance. A lot of this critique of like, people are going to avoid the things that they're traumatized by and they'll never heal. That's not real. That's not true. It doesn't create avoidance. It doesn't actually bear out in the research this criticism that they'll cause people to avoid the things that they're disturbed of or afraid of. That's not a real thing. If anything, actually, it seems to have kind of the opposite effect, which is also bad. We're going to talk about this later, but less than 6% took the option to avoid the distressing content after being warned. A lot of this is essentially the forbidden fruit effect, right? When we tell people that they can't have something or that you shouldn't look at something, then we want it, right? This is part of why restriction is really terrible and useless as far as like diets are concerned, as far as like really any behavior modification is concerned. It's not helpful. It sort of does the opposite. That's not the way that your brain is meant to work. So altogether, I think this paints a pretty clear picture that, as the researchers put it, the current study and other research suggests that trigger warnings do not seem to be an effective method for preventing vulnerable populations from engaging with distressing stimuli. I think that's totally valid. And like we talked about earlier, I think a lot of these headlines and also in a way, the meta-analysis is kind of missing the point. I think first of all, it's really important for us to be clear that trigger warnings generally can never actually encapsulate what is potentially a trigger for anyone and everyone, right? Triggers are very specific. They tend to be related to the trauma that you survived. And so it's common for people to have triggers that aren't actually related to like just using a word that's associated with a particular type of trauma, right? For example, one of my triggers for a very long time was a song that was on the Billboard Top 100, right? That's not really a very specific or not a very general thing. And also not a thing that most people could account for, right? I don't think content creators were like, hey, just in case this song's coming, like no one would think to do that, right? Triggers are usually very specific to the person. And so trigger warnings can be helpful, I guess, in terms of helping us avoid distressing material in theory, but in practice, that's not really what we see. And it's also kind of impossible for us to really effectively warn people when something that's potentially a trigger is coming. The other part of this conversation that I think is really important to have, though, is that trigger warnings, as they've evolved socially, are less and less about actually preventing people or like, in theory, giving people a, like, this thing is coming, like, be careful, and more so about, like, an informed consent type of situation. I think the way that they've evolved now has become more of a, tool of informed consent in the way that we're sort of telling people like, hey, as a heads up, this is what you're walking into. And so if you want to be present for that conversation, then you can keep watching, right? And if you don't want to, this is the moment at which I would encourage you to opt out, right? We know from the research that people are less likely to do that than we think they are. And also, I think it's more so like an act of compassion. It's an act of respect. In my mind, this feels similar to businesses that have like the little stickies in the window that say things like, you are welcome here, right? And like the little rainbow, like the pride flag. It's not so much that they're saying that like, if you walk through this threshold that like good and or bad things are happening to you, or that like we're gonna greet you with like rainbow confetti and that we're gonna be like, say gay, you gay. It's like more so about like a we see you and like we respect you here type of thing than it is about like creating some kind of intended like a consequence. Also, for what it's worth, a lot of the people who have issues with trigger warnings existing or say that they're for like snowflakes and we're coddling people and whatever, I do think it's important to point out that a trigger warning or like a heads up or just like a checkpoint kind of disclaimer, those types of things have existed for a very long time, right? The little preamble that happens at the beginning of Unsolved Mysteries or Law and Order SVU is essentially a trigger warning, right? Just because we put different language around it doesn't mean that it's now a different thing. As a cultural phenomenon, this idea that like, maybe we should give people a heads up in case they're unfamiliar with what Law and Order SVU is really about. Like, just in case, like if you're a babysitter, maybe turn this freaking show off. Like that's kind of the point of the whole thing. And so this like, pearl clutching about trigger warnings existing is kind of phony in my opinion. And again, as a cultural phenomenon, like a thing that we have participated in as an act of community care, essentially. Aaron just said off camera too, literally movie ratings, like that's also a form of that, right? Just because we're rating a movie as something doesn't mean we're saying like, ooh, boop, 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 boop. Like it's more of a heads up and again, a checkpoint opportunity. That said, I do also have some critiques about the concept of trigger warnings. I hope that y'all didn't think that you would get out of this video without me having like somewhat of a controversial take about something, mostly about the entitlement that surrounds the concept of trigger and or content warnings, and also like the assumptions that people jump to when someone doesn't include one or forgets to include one, especially because like the assumptions that are made often, in my opinion, seem to be done in bad faith, which doesn't make sense to me. It does kind of feel like the thing or like the joke about how sometimes things are so far left that they circle back around towards the right type of thing, because it turns into almost like a call for censorship sometimes where like you didn't include a trigger warning and so like therefore you're getting booted off the internet, right? And like I don't know, it seems like the entitlement with which people seem to sort of float around the internet is odd to me. And I think also the bad faith assumption that because a creator didn't or forgot to or, imperfectly included a trigger warning, that therefore they have like malintent towards their audience is like really a lot, right? I have had people accuse me of traumatizing my audience for not including trigger warnings in talking about feet and in talking about periods or menstruation, right? I've had people accuse me of traumatizing my audience and not appropriately including a trigger warning about eating disorders and those types of things on a video where the words eating disorder were in the title, right? And this is what I'm talking about, like this attitude where like you are a terrible person and so therefore you are like, you should not be allowed to exist on the internet because you are, you have malintent, you hate people with eating disorders because you didn't include a clear enough trigger warning about eating disorders, even though the words eating disorder were in the title of your video. Like, be so for real. Like, let's all just level set that is a little bit out to lunch type of behavior. And this is what I mean when I say that like the entitlement that can sometimes come with this attitude around trigger warnings and content warnings can go a little bit unchecked and can also become unhelpful. I think, to be fair, there is a greater conversation to be had about media literacy, which has become an issue in recent years, but that is a conversation for a different day. All of this to say, I guess, that just because there is a lack of a clear black and white warning on something does not indicate active hostility, right? Rather, I think it's helpful to reframe things like trigger warnings and content warnings as essentially an act of community care and as an act of compassion for one's fellow community member, rather than a thing that like, if you don't do this, then you don't pass go, you don't collect 200, and also you're a terrible person and we hate you. Another thing that I want to talk about here is the way that this can turn into a form of like toxic individualism really quickly. I have noticed just as in my own anecdotal data that sometimes the folks who are quick to demand a very specific trigger warning or content warning for themselves are also the folks who seem strangely comfortable to post things in comment sections saying like, I have sensitivity around, issue A, B, or C. And here is the really graphic and gory account of why I have that sensitivity, and like a really long comment about all of the things that have happened to me in this regard. So thanks a lot for not having a trigger warning or a content warning on this video. And it's kind of like paradoxical and confusing to me. And again, I think this has just kind of become a bit of a, flag, I guess, for the way that toxic individualism can sort of take over movements like this. And I think that's really sad because, again, ultimately at the core, viewing trigger warnings as an act of community care and ultimately a form of informed consent, not just for ourselves, but for the community at large, is a really valuable way to view them. Also, to be clear, I do just want, as like a caveat, I can't help myself. It is a very valid desire as a trauma survivor to want to feel seen, and I understand why that happens on this channel specifically, because for a lot of people, the content that I make does feel like uniquely suited to see them, right? Like we talk about a lot of things that don't get talked about on the internet. So it's not that those people are bad or terrible. I just want to be clear. If you've done that, don't feel like you're a terrible person. It happens in trauma recovery. We do all work through our own things. I do just want to highlight that sometimes this desire to be seen in a like really specific individual type of way can cause us to accidentally trample over top of the folks that we are sharing community with. And again, ultimately, that's not the goal when we talk about something like a trigger warning or a content warning. Okay, additionally, I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention this before we wrap this up, which is that trigger warnings and content warnings, these are, or triggers, I suppose, rather, these are things that can be a sign of work that's yet to be done, right? This doesn't mean that we should avoid doing that work, but that it's just work that's yet to be done, right? We've yet to get there in our healing journey. And so ultimately the goal is not to craft a life in which we are free from anything that will potentially poke or prod or cause us distress, but rather to use trigger warnings and content warnings as a way to create safety and like a bumper for us while we're in process in doing that work. I think it's very valid and like a really good piece of advice to use those as part of your own safety toolkit, right? And also, again, even though the research tells us that they don't create avoidance long term, I do also just want to give you like a little fist bump from afar that if you're still working on those things, do continue practicing being brave in doing that work. Don't subject yourself to content that you shouldn't be watching, but being brave in doing the work, in doing the healing, because ultimately, as we continue to process and work through the trauma, we will need trigger warnings around that specific issue less and less. And again, that's ultimately the goal when we talk about trauma healing and even long-term trauma healing, right? Like PTSD, CPTSD. Ultimately, the goal is to desensitize our brain and to help it to reintegrate that information so that we are not feeling as though we're walking through like a haunted house or like a you know, an illusionist museum or whatever those fucking creepy mirror things are, with like weird stuff around the corner, right? We want to be able to be in a place where we feel, generally speaking, unperturbed by like, you know, average everyday stuff anyways. That said, we are going to continue to use trigger warnings and content warnings as we can, right? I really value them as a piece of community care, and also as like essentially a piece of informed consent, right? I want to give you guys the good faith option to opt in or opt out to things that, you know, might come up. That said, it is possible that things will come up that we didn't anticipate, especially we live stream here a lot, right? And also in our podcast, that's not a scripted piece of media, actually. And so sometimes things will come up that we didn't anticipate for. And so while we will do our good faith best to give you that option to opt in and opt out, I do also ask that folks be mindful about that things might come up, and that ultimately my hope is that you guys are able to utilize your safety toolkit to protect yourselves in whatever way works best for you, and to understand that if things come up or we do forget a trigger warning or a content warning or something like that, that it's not because we dislike you, and it's certainly not because we don't care about this community. We care deeply about this community. I do just also want to, I guess, set that boundary in understanding that if we forget those things or that they don't come up here, again, our general practice is to use them, and also that things slip through the cracks. So I hope that this was informative and or useful. I know that this is going to stir up feelings for folks, so let me know what your guys' thoughts are in the comments section, especially if you have been, you know, around like I have for the evolution of the internet for a little while. I would love to know what your thoughts and feelings are about how things have evolved and continue to change, because I think it's interesting perspective. So, okay, thank you very much. If you liked the video, you can like the video, you can subscribe. We talk about stuff like this, and we also do cutesy pop culture moments, very cute, very demure. So I'd love to have you stay for that. And then you can share the video to help the channel grow and to help each other grow. I almost forgot my own outro, and love you the most. See you next week. Bye.